Say had no idea why Hobons existed where it did. The capital of the Holy Kingdom had the odd distinction of being the only seat of national power in the region that was not also the largest city in the country. That crown went to the city of Dibonai in the southern Holy Kingdom, which was supposedly half again as large as Hobons before the war. Hobons was on the wrong side of a small range of hills that stood between the city and the Holy Kingdom's central bay. No major rivers flowed through it and there weren't any notable resources that might have turned it into a center of trade. The only things that stood out about the city were that both the royal palace and the great cathedral were located there, making Hobons the seat of political and religious power in the Holy Kingdom. But cities weren't supposed to work that way. At least not according to her studies as she prepared for her future career as an inspector for the Ministry of Transportation. There was absolutely no sense in its location. It was as if someone decided to stick the palace and the cathedral there first, then expected people to come and live there for no other reason. The main line of reasoning that Say encountered was that Hobons served as a logistical hub for the Northern Holy Kingdom, forming one point in a line of major cities that straddled the inland transportation corridor that ran from Rimian to the Great Wall. People regurgitated that reasoning as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, but it was logic that would only be accepted by civilizations that existed in landlocked regions, which the Holy Kingdom was not. Unlike those civilizations in landlocked regions, the Holy Kingdom had this amazing thing called the sea. With another amazing thing called a ship, the Holy Kingdom could transport cargo, be it goods or soldiers, from Rimian, the port city on the western end of the Northern Holy Kingdom, to the Great Wall. That route was a tenth of the cost and twice as fast as going overland from Kalincha, the closest city to the Great Wall, to the Great Wall. On top of that, the Holy Kingdom's longtime allies all lived in the sea while their greatest enemies dwelt on land. Being on the coast ensured a safe and quick escape route for their civilians during invasions and made for easier communication and coordination with their friends. Thus, Hobons should have been on the other side of the hills, on the coast a mere day away. If the Holy Kingdom wanted something to protect their inland transportation corridor and serve as a mustering location for the army, they could have just built a castle or something near the town that would have existed where Hobons currently was. Like the Great Wall itself, the city of Hobons was indicative of the sort of nonsense that the Holy Kingdom's collective cultural imagination was filled with. They took action based on what they considered attractive or aesthetically pleasing without first making sure that the ideas they had latched onto were the best use of their time and resources. They never learned their lesson, either. Instead, they clung to those completed ideas with all of their problems, permanently saddling themselves with logistical and economic inefficiencies that sapped away a huge chunk of their country's power. Just as bad was the fact that they had immersed themselves in those ideas, crippling their thinking. The sour thoughts behind Say's pleasant mask remained unchanged as she bit into a juicy nectarine. She had eaten so much fruit since arriving in the Holy Kingdom that it all tasted the same to her. All of the other food was so expensive that she refused to buy any out of principle. She left the street to wait at the entrance of a narrow alley as a convoy of wagons escorted by liveried men went by. It smelled like another shipment of fruit from the countryside. They should have been using most of it to make jam and preserves, but the Holy Kingdom was short on what they needed for that. All they could do was keep dumping food into the city. Most of the citizens didn't mind, however. They saw it as a reprieve from the ever-increasing prices of food and other commodities. Once the convoy passed, she resumed her stroll to the water gardens. An annoyed sigh left her lips as she crossed into the covered walkways with their bright signs and flowing fountains. Yet another afternoon had gone by and she hadn't located her target. "Ara, Say, welcome back." A tall, darkly handsome man greeted her as she approached one of the district's luxury establishments. Say returned his greeting with a smile. "Thanks, Orlando. How busy are we?" "Some of the regulars appeared early," Orlando replied, "but you shouldn't need to come in until the evening. By the way, did you manage to spot what I asked about while you were out there?" Say shook her head. "It's all fresh fruit and the usual stuff." Orlando clicked his tongue, crossing his arms and rubbing his chin. "How much do you have left?" Say asked. "A month's supply, at most. With all of the new faces showing up, probably less." What he had asked her to keep an eye out for were liquors and wines made from fruit. They didn't take long to make and should have started appearing shortly after the beginning of the fruit harvest. "Want me to figure out what's going on?" Say asked. "I wouldn't want to ask anything unreasonable of you." I'm a bard, Say said. We're not just about arts and entertainment, you know? Well, if you insist that it's all right, if you can secure us a supply, I'll make sure to add something extra to your pay. Thanks. Say grinned. I'm going to rest for a bit before tonight. She walked around the building and went in through the employee entrance, ascending the narrow stairwell to her room on the 4th story. A wave of heat washed over her as she opened the door. The room was built into the building's attic, but it wouldn't affect her so long as she kept her brooch on. She tossed her things on the floor, sitting down on her small bed to pull off her boots and stretch her legs. Something moved between the beams of the ceiling. Say retrieved a palm-sized crystal from her bag, activating it to create a bubble of silence around the room. As the other presence in the room drew close, she turned and grabbed it by the shoulders, shaking it as she spoke. What's going on here? I've been looking for the target for 3 days and I can't find her anywhere. After the shadow demon's glowing amber eyes stopped swirling, it produced a folded piece of paper. Say frowned as she scanned through the encrypted content. Subject released from holding pattern. Entered city 4 days ago. Attempt at reobtaining gainful employment rejected due to problematic official record. Started altercations on the palace grounds, leaving several noblewomen unconscious before fleeing. Last seen headed into Pleasure District. I know all that, Say muttered. That was why she was where she was, after all. Much like the elder liches at home, many of the agents that worked for Foreign Affairs were exhaustive in their reporting. This was because Lord Demiurge recognized that information was interpreted by different people in different ways. Bards had a broad, knowledge-based skill set, so Say was well suited to working as a handler for the Sorceress Kingdom's assets in the Holy Kingdom. Most of them were combat-oriented and couldn't make any sense out of human society, so they just ended up telling her every little bit of information that they came across. Queries conducted on behalf of victims suggest subject is no longer in Hobans. 2 accounts describe woman bearing similarities to subject departing north. She's not even in the city? Say bit her lip, then looked over at the shadow demon. We're going to have to brute force this. Is the Hanzo doing anything? The shadow demon shook its head. Send him out to search the communities north of the city, Say said. The target probably went looking for a job. Once you find her, don't do anything to get her back. I'll go to her. Her shadowy counterpart flickered away. Say folded the piece of paper and stuck it inside a coat pocket. Once she returned to the alley, she tossed it into the brazier lighting the alley entrance. Orlando was still at the front, welcoming a stream of guests. Say frowned at the suddenly crowded streets for a moment before going back to the employee entrance. She walked past the stairs and into the corridor that ran behind the guest chambers. Afonso, one of the establishment's managers, waved her over to the entrance of the staff room. Say, he said, thank the gods you showed up. We've got a full house. So early? Say pressed herself against the wall to stay out of the way. Some nobles came in from another city. Their men are swarming the entire district. Which houses? Guests of House Cohen, Afonso told her. From what I can gather, they're scions overseeing the area around Prat. We're hosting their top people. If that was the case, what music was appropriate? Her mind raced through her repertoire of popular scores. What's the atmosphere like? Say asked. They just started coming in, Afonso answered. The VIPs brought women with them, but most of the retainers are on the prowl. Things are calm for now, but we need to finish our preparations quickly. Once you're done helping here, head to the throne room. She nodded and Afonso rushed off. Say turned to regard the chaos of the staff room. Dozens of women in various states of dress hurried about and clothing literally flew through the air as they frantically tried to coordinate their appearances. Say went over to a booth with a polished brass mirror, where Lita, a buxom brunette with big doe eyes, was desperately trying to pull up her top. Help, she cried. Say spent all of 3 seconds trying to adjust Lita's corselet before giving up. This is way too small, Say told her as she undid the strings. Are you trying to faint 5 minutes into work? Lita's only reply was a whimper. Say walked off, looking for something that would fit. The Queen of Thorns was thriving, but the influx of new staff combined with the lack of tailoring materials made its available wardrobe sorely lacking. She returned with something better a minute later. I wish I was nice and slender like you, Lita sighed. I wouldn't have so much trouble finding something that fits. I'm sure most of our customers prefer you the way that you are, Say replied. Do nobles come around with their men like this often? Once in a while. It always catches us off guard. Nobles don't make reservations with us like they would with one of their fancy restaurants, they just pop up whenever they feel like it. If they came from another city, Say said, there has to be a reason. I don't know, Lita said, I'm not smart like you. I'm just paid to smother men with my tits. Say wasn't sure whether it was a matter of being smart or not. If a goblin could become an engineer, then Lita could at least strive to improve herself while smothering men with her tits. The only thing that was stopping her was herself. After combing out Lita's hair and painting her lips, Say handed the woman a domino mask before kneeling to rummage through a box filled with props. She returned to her feet with a coiled whip in hand. Eh? The whip? Lita's eyes went wide behind her mask. I'm still scared of that thing. What if one of the nobles wants me to hit them? Then they have to pay extra, Say said. Lita had a point, though. As far as her work went, she kept men company and poured them drinks. She let people get handsy with her, and her shy response tickled the fancy of many customers, making her a high earner. Her premium service was knocking people out with her giant knockers, so it would be a problem if people mistook her carrying a whip as a new option. Say put the whip back and picked up an oversized corsage of woven black roses instead. After a last-minute check, Say turned Lita around and smacked her butt. Lita squeaked and scurried off, a light blush coloring her cheeks. Another woman came to take her place. You're a real natural at this, you know? The fiery-haired woman, who went by the name of Carmen, told her. If I didn't know better, I'd have thought you've been around for years. I had a job at another place like this before, Say said. It wasn't in this country, though. That much wasn't a lie. As a part of her training as an intelligence agent, she had been sent to work at the Purple Apothecary and the other brothels in Nirantal. What she did there wasn't much different from what she was doing now, aside from the fact that her skills as a bard had vastly improved since then. Guess men are the same everywhere, Carmen snorted. This place is a lot more specialized, Say said. Where I worked before was in a small city, so they had everything in a few establishments. Oh, do you know anything about tonight's customers? They sound like they're here for a celebration. Who knows? Carmen shrugged. That sort of thing's too big for small folk like us. These people. They were so obsessed with protecting their place. That got in the way of understanding what they were and what they were capable of. In their minds, the minds of their clients, and the minds of everyone that spared a thought for them, they were the lowest of the low and were probably even considered subhuman. Stranger still was the fact that the faith of the Four, with its perverse and heretical system of values, somehow also shunned them for merely existing. Orlando had been granted a knighthood, so maybe the seeds of change had already been planted. For the time being, however, Say could only be annoyed by everything. Once the staff room emptied, Say picked up her lute and went through the service corridor to the throne room, the largest hall in the Queen of Thorns. The crowd within could be heard long before she ascended to the musician's booth, which overlooked the entire chamber. The ceiling had a simple design crafted to convey sound from the booth to every part of the hall, meaning that anyone sitting in the booth could also hear everything that was going on. Bards used the feature to read the mood of the crowd and keep track of the events going on around them. Normally, this was done in order to figure out what performances were appropriate at any given time. As a spy, however, Say also used it to collect a mountain of information from the customers. With the economic conditions of the Holy Kingdom being what they were, it meant that everyone that she spied on was a noble, someone important who worked for a noble, or someone of substantial means and influence. In other words, it was an ideal place for Say to work, one where she could refine her craft in many ways while also doing things that would help her out in her job. Just how many houses are present? Her eyes went to the dais at the head of the hall as she lightly plucked out a tune. As expected, a man in the colors of House Cohen, one of the major houses managing things in the East, sat at the head of the table there. Beside the man was a woman who looked like she was in her teens, though Say couldn't be sure whether she was his wife, mistress, or something else. Considering that they were in what was basically a brothel in the Holy Kingdom, it probably wasn't his wife. Seated at the table to either side of him were men of other houses and their women. Their glasses were still full and they appeared to be focused on watching the other guests filter into the hall. Say switched to the upbeat chords of The Wind of Rimune, a popular song that heralded the coming of prosperity in the Holy Kingdom. In response, the guests grew more lively and mingled more openly. Say kept an eye on what they were doing while sorting out the countless conversations that reached her ears. Many of them were brief, congratulatory exchanges. Sets of men took turns presenting themselves to the people seated at the dais, offering their praise to the guests seated there before joining the merrymaking. So it is a celebration. The man seated at the head of the main table was Eduardo Cohen, the heir apparent of House Cohen. Seated at his table were the sons of houses allied to his own. Despite the festive atmosphere below them, the lordlings maintained an air of dignity and proper decorum, at least until the last of the guests came by to pay their respects. "I still can't believe that worked," the man to Eduardo's immediate right said. "Of course it worked," Eduardo scoffed. "That man recognizes nothing but those silly numbers of his. My lord father was right to start with Prat. The fools squabbling over Hobans will never catch up, now. It's not so much that as the fact it went through so easily. Shouldn't the court have been more stringent in their assessment?" "You can't be serious, Aquino," the lordling on the other side of Eduardo Cohen said. "The fleet will arrive soon. Duke de Bonai and his allies are all but guaranteed to side with Caspond's brother. Caspond cannot risk angering his closest supporters until all challenges to his rule are settled. This game is ours to play as we see fit until then." "You're wrong," Eduardo said. The smiles all along the table vanished as the assembled scions turned their heads curiously at Eduardo's denial. "Not until then," Eduardo told them. "Indefinitely. Over these past few months, how much of the country's gold has fallen into our hands? How much of its land? How many of its people do we hold under our sway? Who owns their debts? When the fleet returns, we will dominate the country's trade and undermine the power of the Admiralty. So long as we play things right, the entire Holy Kingdom is ours for the taking." Say looked away from the main table as the smiles returned. Eduardo's voice could probably be heard halfway across the hall, yet no one showed any sign of being disturbed by his words. If anything, the men seemed to draw confidence from them, growing proud and ever more boisterous. "So," Aquino leaned in on his elbow, "what's our next move? Calintia and Prat already belong to us. The passage of the royal army caused some disruptions in the east, but things are back in order now. Should we prepare to seize the northern frontier once it's conquered?" "No," Eduardo shook his head, "let the fools spend a lifetime taming those savage lands. No." The corner of Say's eyelid twitched as a distressed cry interrupted the lordling. Near the center of the hall, Lita was trying to escape from the clutches of a man twice her size. Her top had been ripped off and the man's hands squeezed her huge breasts as if they were lumps of dough. "Come to Gaspar," the man said as he ran his tongue over her shoulder. "The Lion of Prat will show you such passion that you have never experienced." Lita's only reply was another scream. Her tormentor sounded, and looked, so lame to say, but he must have been terrifying to Lita. The flesh of her breast squeezing out from between the man's fingers was turning a painful shade of purple. Behind a leather chaise a few meters away, Carmen looked like she wanted to club the man in the back of his head with the giant bottle of wine in her hands. The nearby guests laughed at the scene while those further away ignored it entirely, engrossed in their own activities. Say clicked her tongue. "You interrupted the discussion for this?" She sent a discordant strain from her lute, bouncing it off of the ceiling to strike the Lion of Prat in the back of the head. The spectators hushed as he flopped to the ground. Lita wasted no time fleeing from the hall, leaving behind her top and a trail of sobs. Carmen held up the bottle in her hands, peering at its contents as the man's snores rose from the floor. "One?" She frowned. The silence lasted for exactly 2 seconds more before the crowd burst into laughter. "One? One drink? So much for the Lion of Prat." Say resumed her song and the guests returned to their pursuit of alcohol, feminine company, and fleshly pleasures. The musician's booth wasn't just a discreet stage and a convenient place to spy from, it was also an artillery platform. She wasn't sure how many bards used them that way, though. "I believe that was one of your men, Belmonte," Eduardo said. The lordling 2 seats to Eduardo's right swallowed. "He'll be disposed of before we return to Prat, Lord Eduardo." "Good. Retainers of that caliber do nothing but reflect poorly on us. As I was saying before we were interrupted, we'll be spreading our influence west." "West?" Aquino furrowed his brow. But didn't you just say that we shouldn't waste our time with Hobens? I did, Eduardo nodded, and we won't. We'll ignore the capital in favor of working on Lloyd's prefecture. One of the lordlings thumped his fist against the table, a gleam of excitement in his eye. So we're finally doing it, he said. We're moving against those hidebound traditionalists. Don't they call themselves the conservatives, now? They can hardly be the traditionalists if they're not on the side of the temples and the Holy King. However you dress them, they're still the same houses, ones that are long past due for a lesson in humility. But how? Aquino asked. If we act with open aggression, it will only cause headaches for our parents at court. We'll employ the same methods that we used to seize Kalincha and Prat. We're much stronger than we were back then. By comparison, the idiots managing the lands in the west have barely made any gains. But some of the men they've been supporting have. Indeed. About that, we've received a request to deal with one particularly problematic fellow. Iago Lausa. Lausa, you mean the new black? The same, Eduardo nodded. But isn't Rastello his patron? He should be an ally. Rastello is the one who made the request. It seems that Lausa has been doing business with both sides. That scum, Belmonte spat. And here I thought he was doing something befitting a noble. Lukewarm associates should be spat out. Aquino fingered his wine glass. Has a replacement been prepared? Rastello will take care of that part, Eduardo said. We're just here so that none of the rest can be traced back to him. Several of the lordlings nodded with looks of understanding. So that's why you had us bring so many of our retainers along with us, Belmonte said. Convenient, no? Eduardo smirked, but we will not move until we are good and ready. Anyone who attempts to move before that, I will personally drown in the bay. Well, that was juicier than I expected. By and large, the average person in the Holy Kingdom was far more decent than the average person in Riestais, so coming across such an aggressive plot was a pleasant surprise in her otherwise uneventful experience so far. She thought that she would have to shake everything up by herself. When the last of the guests finally cleared out just before dawn, Say returned to her room, humming happily over her hefty haul of interesting information. Once she closed the door, a shadow demon drifted down again from the ceiling. It produced a folded slip of paper and wordlessly handed it over. Subject has been located 20 kilometers northwest of Hobens. Appears to have found employment patrolling the holdings of one Iago Lausa. She folded the paper again and handed it back to the shadow demon. Well, Say smiled, that's just perfect. There she is. Astride her chestnut steed, Naya chewed on a head of dried grass as she watched a pair of ranchers guide a cow and her calf back to their herd. The two Lanka had gotten lost somehow earlier that day, but it didn't take long for her men to track them down. Track, huh? I guess father was right. The ranchers did indeed seem to be rangers. Naya could see that everything they did was something that rangers were known for. They ranged over their territory, which consisted of open grasslands rather than forests, just as any ranger would. Every one of them somehow grasped the condition of the land without thinking, driving their cattle from place to place as necessary without needing to confer with their fellows. The men tirelessly maintained their vigil throughout the day, keeping the herds together, fighting off wild beasts, and deterring human trespassers. Human trespassers, huh? She hadn't witnessed that part, yet. Of course, they mentioned it to her back when she was patrolling as part of the Holy Order, but land disputes weren't rare even before Yaldabaoth's invasion. Storms came, knocking over fences or moving markers, and everyone swore that the border was a meter or two in their favor when putting them back up. The Holy Order was called upon to intervene only if the local leaders couldn't make a call and rulings had to be made on their behalf. Naya idly plucked her bowstring while she eyed the horizon, alert for the telltale silhouettes of humans trekking over the grassland. What would she do if it happened? Fighting off beasts and monsters was fine, but she didn't want to fight her own people. Well, they didn't mention fighting people at all, so maybe I'm overthinking things. Work on the ranch kept her busy, but it wasn't the same sort of busy as in the cities or working with the Holy Order. Overall, it was a relaxing way of life that afforded her a lot of time to think. The people were similarly relaxed and easy to get along with. When she thought about it a bit more, she couldn't imagine any violence occurring. She nudged her mount into a walk as the herd started moving. Where are we going next? Naya asked. There's a small river 3 kilometers down the other side of this ridge, Carlos, the rancher riding beside her, said. We'll be setting up camp there. Nia nodded, watching the Sea of Lanka as they plodded their way forward. When they crested the ridge, she took in the vast landscape under the clear blue sky. She pointed to a distant patch of off-colored fields to the south. Is that a farming village over there? It is, Carlos nodded. Gora. Really? How did I not know that? Gora was one of the stops along her old patrol route, so she thought she should have noticed. Then again, it wasn't as if they were following the roads. Do you ever have any trouble with the farming villages? Nia asked. We make sure to keep the herds a few hundred meters from their fields, Carlos replied. Lauser gives them milk from time to time, but they still sneak onto our land to steal Lanka chips. We don't fight them over that, do we? It's sad to see the people so desperate, but theft is theft. Lanka chips were piles of dried Lanka manure. It would be inconceivable to city dwellers that one would so jealously guard their little crap, but it was a valuable resource. Not only was it fertilizer, but the womenfolk in Mr. Lauser's holdings also regularly came around with carts, collecting it to use as fuel for their fires. Nia gestured to the veil of haze that drifted from the village. If they're short on fuel, she said, then why are they turning copsewood into charcoal to sell in town? Because it's the easiest thing for them to sell until their crops are ready, Carlos shrugged. They need to survive until then. I see. In that case, why not loan them Nia's voice trailed off as she tried to figure out how to phrase it. Loan them your poop just sounded wrong. The man's chuckle filled the awkward silence. Doesn't work, he told her. Why? It's hard to put a finger on why, Carlos said. Maybe it's because we don't see eye to eye on what's worth what. Aside from that, the nobles managing those territories refuse to recognize it as a proper commodity. Neither do the merchants. It was yet another way that the ranchers were similar to her father. They had a distinct sense of wholeness that they strictly enforced on the ranch whenever they could. Everything was a part of something, and they saw themselves as a part of that something. Everything had value and absolutely nothing was considered waste. As with most professional rangers, they considered themselves custodians of the land that maintained its balance, not masters who tamed it to suit their whims. Nia could never quite figure out how it worked, but she knew better than to try and dislodge them from their thinking. So what do you do about it? Nia asked. All we can really do is deter them. Patrols will keep them from bringing out wagons to collect the stuff, but they'll still send out their kids to snatch what they can when we're not around. She envisioned herself riding after kids over piles of Lanka dung. In hindsight, she was glad that she didn't have to settle any poop-related disputes when she was working for the Holy Order. When they arrived at the river, Nia's company split up to raise 20 camps around the perimeter of the herd. Though outsiders might have scoffed at the idea that ranchers might organize themselves like the army, each of Mr. Lauser's herds had 2,000 Lanka and a company was just enough to do everything related to taking care of them. Mr. Lauser had 5 such herds, which roamed a 2,000 square kilometer strip of land that wrapped around the Kingswood northwest of Hobens. Nia took a clipboard out of her saddlebags and visited each camp before she lost the daylight, recording any problems and changes that the ranchers had noticed over the course of the day. That seemed to be a more practical reason why she had been made a captain. Very few of the ranchers could read or write very well, if at all. A pack of stray dogs attacked the herd's northern flank. A bunya colony is digging up holes along the grazing route. 2 cows got sick. 12 new calves, that's good. That was probably the best part about her new job. Lanka calves were cute. She wondered what Shizu would think of them. The maid demon had come by once after the end of the war to pick up the equipment that the Sorcerer King had lent to her, but, unfortunately, Nia was busy with work and Shizu couldn't stay for long. Nia wondered what the maid demon was doing now. The Sorcerer King had taken her back with him to the Sorceress Kingdom, but he never did specify what he wanted the maid demons for. They were strong and people came to certain conclusions because of that, but would the Sorceress Kingdom have any enemies at all? The Empire was their client state and Riestais had recently been defeated by them in a war. Roblay's delegation tried to learn what they could about the Battle of Katsa Plains before heading to the Sorceress Kingdom and came away with the sense that no one wanted to fight the Sorceress Kingdom ever again. I should have accepted their invitation to go visit. The last time she had seen her, Shizu had invited her to come over and play, but Naya felt that she had a duty to help in the Holy Kingdom's recovery and spread the wisdom of the Sorcerer King. If knew of the thankless fate that awaited her, she would have taken Shizu up on her offer without a second thought. By the time Naya returned to her camp, a simmering pot of stew was waiting to greet her. Her stomach growled as the wind blew its appetizing aroma in her direction. "That smells good." Naya sat on one of the boulders circling the campfire. "I didn't know we had meat." Some dried fish went into their rations, but that was it as far as she knew. "We didn't." "Then where did we get the meat from?" "Our calves were being nipped at by some dogs. One of our guys dropped one off just now." "Oh. I should have expected that." People who went onto the ranch without permission were trespassers. Animals that did the same thing were trespassers they could eat. As far as rangers were concerned, it was population management. She put her report away and picked up her bow. It had been a long time since she had gotten any practice and she wanted to get used to her new weapon. The 4 men in her camp gathered behind her, looking on curiously as she placed a peach pit on a distant rock. Naya paid them no mind, however. She nocked an arrow and drew the bow in a smooth motion, casting aside the turmoil of the past few days. Once her mind was clear of all thoughts, even those of poop and dog meat, which were unexpectedly difficult to get rid of, she stilled her breath and released the arrow. The missile whistled through the air, knocking the peach pit off of the rock. Whistles rose from the men behind her. "Didn't you just get that?" One of the men gestured at her weapon. "I did." Naya's lip twitched as she answered. "I was going to practice to get used to it, but..." She hadn't practiced in over a month, yet it didn't seem that way. That was probably because she had used the technique she had learned during the war. Naya would have said so, but she didn't know how the men would react if she told them that she had imbued her arrow with divine power to attack a peach pit. One of the men returned with her arrow. The peach pit was back on its rock, so Naya knocked it off again. "What? Bullshit!" Exclamations of awe and disbelief rose from her spectators. One of the ranchers went to retrieve the arrow and reset the target while another stepped up and loaded his crossbow. Naya smiled to herself as she watched the men take turns trying to match her feat. It reminded her of the war, back when she had first started building up her following. Now that she thought about it, it was around the same time she had been given a unit to command, as well. "I wonder how everyone's doing these days." After the liberation of Kalincha, the Sorcerer King Rescue Corps, the organization that consisted of the men and women that had come to recognize the greatness of His Majesty the Sorcerer King, had reportedly grown to around 30,000 people. Following the reconquest of Hobans, which was when the Sorcerer King decided that it was time to return to the Sorceress Kingdom, Naya had arranged as grand a farewell as she could. In the end, even though it was probably their last chance to see the Sorcerer King, all she could muster was a bit over 3,000. The membership of the organization continued to grow on paper, but, at the same time, the number of active members dwindled until the liberation of Rimian and its surrounding territories. At that point, the war officially ended. Everyone went back to their homes and Naya was buried in work. She was sure that it was like that for everyone else, too. They had all been so enthusiastic about spreading the Sorcerer King's wisdom, but then the realities of the post-war recovery took over every waking hour of the day. In other words, life happened. No matter how enthusiastic one was about their new philosophical outlook, one still had to eat. Would they keep the Sorcerer King's wisdom close to their hearts? How did they apply it to their lives? In times of war, encouraging people to better themselves so their weakness wouldn't lead to future woes was easy. Saying the same thing to starving people would just make her sound like a self-righteous windbag. It wasn't as if getting stronger would make fields of seedlings mature and ripen overnight. Most of what people did and the realities that they were subjected to in everyday life had nothing to do with weakness at all. Then, there were the people who were doing fine or at least living a tolerable life. Once the war was behind them, Naya's words never seemed to reach their hearts. Either they felt that what they had was sufficient, weren't willing to invest the time to take even the smallest steps toward bettering themselves, or both. Are the benefits of becoming stronger really that hard to grasp? Watching the ranchers continue to miss the peach pit for a few minutes before giving up, she could only believe that it was. She couldn't quite put words to the feeling, but becoming as strong as she currently was would have been unimaginable to the Nayabaraha of a year ago. It was the realm of prolific adventurers, geniuses, and the privileged elite. Everyone else was content to live with the choices that they had made, which usually achieved good enough in terms of their normal lives. That good enough then transformed into nowhere near adequate when trouble came knocking at their door. Naya herself had been guilty of that. Before the war, she would have been satisfied with a long and respectable career as a paladin without aspiring to any notable greatness. She would have even thought those aspirations over-ambitious. It was almost as if a curse afflicted the entire Holy Kingdom. The demon gods came and destroyed whoever came before them. Demi-humans from the Abelian Hills raided them constantly for nearly 2 centuries, and yet another fiendish invasion nearly sent them to join their predecessors. With such a history, one might think that people would be interested in breaking the chains of weakness, yet nothing ever changed. Weakness is a sin, so one must become strong, or humbly accept justice similar to that of His Majesty. Her message seemed so obvious back then. The people she had touched with her words were all so fervent about that new truth. Yet, after the flames of war died out, the Holy Kingdom answered clearly to her message. They chose weakness. They chose to be subjected to the justice of the strong, except they weren't in the Sorceress Kingdom where the people were protected by the justice of the Sorcerer King. They chose sin. She suspected that they would forever make that same choice no matter what happened to them. Matters of justice and evil were stomped flat by matters of everyday practicality. Naya excused herself and went to bed early. She stared at the ceiling of her tent for hours while racking her brain for a solution to her conundrum, but she fell asleep no closer to an answer than before. The next afternoon brought their route close to Mr. Lauser's villa, where another company relieved them. Naya and her men arrived at the villa just before twilight, and she went straight to Iago Lauser to deliver her report. "I'm back, Mr. Lauser." "Ah, Naya, welcome back. Did you have any trouble with the men?" "No," Naya shook her head. "Everyone was nice. They even helped me out whenever they saw that I was unfamiliar with something." The shorter man broke into a broad grin. "See," he held out his palms, "is it not as this Iago said? You will have no worries here." "I think you're right," Naya smiled back. "Oh, here's the report." She came forward and set down the documents on his desk. As she stepped away, she cocked an ear as a strain of music drifted into the tent. "A bard?" "Yes, we are lucky indeed," Mr. Lauser nodded. "She came in while you were away. Isn't it a wonder? I haven't heard a bard since the early days of the war. I swear that Yaldabaoth killed them all to crush our spirits." Naya nodded in agreement. There were also other strategic reasons behind him doing so. Foremost among them was the fact that bards were very mobile and were one of the primary ways by which information flowed from country to country. Most places welcomed bards with open arms and didn't impede them, but a fiend like Yaldabaoth would have no qualms about having every bard eliminated to isolate the Holy Kingdom. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to listen for a while." "Please do," Mr. Lauser said cheerfully. "I have arranged for a banquet to be hosted in the new courtyard where she is performing. Everyone is free to enjoy themselves." She bobbed her head respectfully before leaving the tent. A small crowd was present in the aforementioned courtyard, and she marveled at the festive atmosphere that greeted her. "I haven't seen anything remotely close to this since the celebrations at the end of the war." Platters filled with fruit lined the tables along with cuts of beef. They had somehow gotten their hands on plenty of other types of food and even barrels of wine. The people in attendance were dressed in bright colors and sang along to the tune of the Wind of Rimmune. Naya took 2 steps toward the tables before remembering that she had just come in from nearly a week of driving cattle. After cleaning herself up, Naya returned to the courtyard with a fresh change of clothes and an appetite that was far more ravenous than she realized. She filled up her plate and retreated to an out-of-the-way corner, wolfing down her dinner while enjoying the music. I haven't heard this one before. It's nice for this weather, though. I almost feel chilly." Azalizia. Naya leaned back and forth, trying to catch a glimpse of the bard. If she recalled correctly, the Azalizia Mountains were the snowbound peaks that loomed north of Iranthal. She had never seen such huge mountains in her life. If she's singing about them, is she from around there? Or maybe she just picked it up on the way through. It'd be nice to hear some news from the Sorceress Kingdom. To her surprise, the bard appeared out of the crowd. She went to a nearby bench to sit, setting down a carved wooden cup before wiping her face with a damp cloth. "Hey," as expected of a bard, "she's so pretty. Is she really traveling at such a young age?" The bard glanced at her. Too late, Naya averted her gaze. Hello, the bard smiled. Hi. My name's Say, what's yours? Eep. So forward. As expected of a bard. Naya. Naya Baraha. Pleased to meet you, Miss Baraha. I hope you enjoyed the music. Oh, I did, Naya nodded energetically. There was one I hadn't heard before. The one about the Azalizia Mountains. Where is that song from? Ah, Winter's Crown. That one's popular along the western frontier of the Baharuth Empire. And in the Azalizia Mountains, of course. Of course. What was she thinking? Maybe she hadn't been thinking at all. Her enthusiasm overrode everything when it came to anything related to the Sorcerer King. It's a bit weird, though, Say said. What is? Naya asked. The song, Say answered. Even though it's about the Azalizia Mountains, it first appeared in the Sorceress Kingdom. No one knows. Really? Say leaned back as Naya leaned forward. Naya calmed herself down and cleared her throat. Have you been to the Sorceress Kingdom before? I have, Say replied, taking a sip out of her cup. Was there something you wanted to know? Something? More like everything. Aside from what Naya saw on her brief visit to Erantal, she didn't know anything about the Sorcerer King's realm. His Majesty barely talked about it during the war, either. Surely, it was a place where everyone embraced the Sorcerer King's wisdom. She especially wanted to know how they went about it in their everyday lives. The people didn't seem all that different from anyone else when she was there, but that was probably because she wasn't watching for evidence of His Majesty's truth back then. Hello? Oh, Naya blinked. Sorry, I was just thinking about what to ask. I don't have much to pay you for your information. That's right, I nearly forgot in my excitement. Information is valuable to bards. Any information at all about His Majesty the Sorcerer King was undoubtedly worth a pile of treasure. A pile of treasure that Naya Baraha didn't have. In that case, Say asked, how about a trade? I came to learn about the war and how the Holy Kingdom is doing now. There weren't any soldiers in the Sorceress Kingdom that seemed to know about it. That made sense. The only person from the Sorceress Kingdom who came to fight in the Holy Kingdom was the Sorcerer King, after all. All right, Naya nodded. I can do that. You can tell me everything you know about His Majesty's realm, and I'll tell you everything about His Majesty. I wanted to learn about the war in the Holy Kingdom, too. While Say had been to the Sorceress Kingdom, she didn't appear to appreciate the Sorcerer King's greatness. Otherwise, she wouldn't want to hear about anything else. Did that mean she didn't know about the Sorcerer King's wisdom, as well? If so, Naya resolved to open her eyes to the truth. The bard rose from her seat, draining away the rest of her drink. Break's over, she said. Want to meet up after tonight's banquet is over? Of course. Naya stood up. I have a few days off before my next shift, so I'm sure we can share a lot. Great, Say grinned. Where would you like to meet? I have a place on the eastern side of the villa, Naya told her. Unit 7. Really? Mr. Lauser put me in Unit 8. Great, Naya said, that's really convenient. Then, I'll see you then? Yup. Naya returned to her home, giddy over the prospect of having someone to talk about His Majesty to. She went around cleaning things up, even though there wasn't much to clean, then retired to her room to think about what she would say. A knock on the door woke her up. Huh? Wha? She turned her head to look out the window, groaning at what she saw. The days working out on the ranch must have taken a greater toll on her than she thought. Another set of knocks issued from the door. Just a minute, Naya said. She sat up in her bed, trying to comb down her hair with her fingers while straightening out her dress at the same time. It was too dim to see her reflection in the water basin, so she eventually gave up and went to open the door. Say was on the other side, impeccably groomed and carrying a covered basket in the crook of her arm. The bard looked up at her for less than a second before speaking. I can come back tomorrow if this is a bad time. No, it's fine, Naya ushered the bard in. I just dozed off, that's all. Oh. I thought you had a man over or something. Naya yelped as she closed the door on her foot. Did she come off as that sort of woman? No, it was probably a normal expectation. Most at her age were already married or close to it. Naya was the rare exception. Even her mother, who was a renowned paladin, had given birth to her around the same age. The war and her busy schedule after it spared no time for romance. Say placed the basket on the dining room table, pulling back the cover with a flourish to reveal some bread, cheese and a bottle of wine. You shouldn't have. It would be weird if I didn't bring anything as a guest, Say replied. Nia looked down at her dress and tried smoothing out a crease. Everything about the young bard seemed extraordinarily classy. She was probably highly popular wherever she went. Did someone like Nia have any right to entertain such a high-caliber artist? Say seemed like she would be more suited to the courts of high nobles or even kings. The bard settled down at the table, patting its surface as she looked up at Nia with her ice blue eyes. Whether Say sensed her mounting nerves, Nia couldn't tell. It could be that she was already used to reactions like hers. So, Say asked, how would you like to start? Well, Nia answered as she took a seat opposite the bard, since you brought something nice, why don't you ask the first question? All right. Say retrieved a quill, inkwell, and stack of paper from the bottom of the basket. Nia's eyes shimmered as she tensed, ready to spread the word of the Sorcerer King's greatness. Let's start with something easy, Say said. What is the Sorcerer King's favorite color? Huh? Upon hearing the question, Nia's anticipation transformed into ash.